This month of May is National Mental Health Month in the United States. So seems like good timing for this event, especially as we approach questions about police brutality and police violence against people of color, and particularly at times often perhaps against people who are suffering and not receiving help for their mental health within communities of color. I am an archivist at the Leo Baeck Institute, and at the Institute we have a collection of the Mosse family. They were from Berlin. They immigrated largely to the United States. Hilde Mosse, when she came here, she was a doctor, and she became involved in the founding of the Lafargue Clinic. And we're going to learn more about her and her work. That is the Leo Baeck connection to this topic. We have Hilde Mosse's early diaries from Berlin, where she was becoming a communist activist, actually. And we also have some pictures of the Lafargue Clinic. And we have a little bit, we have her funeral eulogy as presented and was recorded at the time by her brother. We have some information about her actual work at the Lafargue Clinic in the later portion of its existence. We'll learn a lot more about her, so I won't go on with that. I invite you to ask questions in the question and answer box at the bottom right of the Zoom screen. And the procedure is for today is we will first hear from Dennis Doyle. He's going to give us a presentation about the history of the Lafargue Clinic. And then we are going to hear from Martin Summers, who's a history professor at Boston College, who will respond to Mr. Doyle's presentation. And then they'll have a short discussion, and then we'll open it up to question and answers from the audience. So we won't get to your questions right away, but we will answer them in due time. I'm going to introduce the presenters in more detail. Dennis Doyle is an associate professor of history at the University of Health Sciences and Pharmacy in St. Louis, Missouri. For the bulk of his career, Doyle has studied the history of psychiatry and its engagement with race in civil rights era Harlem. Since 2009, he's published 6 articles on mental health care in Harlem and a 2016 book on liberal policy efforts to expand healthcare for African Americans in New York City. Since 2013, he and Bob Zabrowski also researched the history of the St. Louis College of Pharmacy, preparing a book for future publication. And Professor Doyle has returned to the Lafargue Clinic most recently for another book he's writing now. And so he also has started a new book-length project investigating the previous century's habit of reinterpreting William Shakespeare's work through the lens of Freud and psychodynamic theory. And I'll introduce next Martin Summers. He's a history professor at Boston College and a cultural historian of the 19th and 20th century United States, with a particular focus on race, gender, sexuality, and medicine. He regularly teaches courses on post-1865 US and African American history, gender and sexuality in African American history, and medicine and public health in the African diaspora. His recently published book, Madness in the City of Magnificent Intentions, A History of Race and Mental Illness in the Nation's Capital, won the 2021 Chiron Book Prize for Outstanding Monograph in Social, Behavioral, Human Sciences. His current book project, Inner City Blues, African American Mental Health and Social Policy in 20th Century Urban America, is a historical examination of how social scientists, psychiatrists, and psychiatric social workers, government officials, and community organizers understood the relationship between urbanization and mental illness. So I invite you both today. Thank you for being part of this and presentation. And we'll start then beginning with Martin with your presentation on the history of the Lafargue Clinic, which I think is a history very few people know about, which in itself is always very surprising to me. So I'll let you share your screen and start. And be sure to unmute yourself.
All right, everybody can hear me? Okay. All right, let me share the screen here. All right. Are the PowerPoint slides visible to everyone? All right, let me go to slide presentation view.
Yep, they're there.
Okay.
Oh, great.
All right, just went to slide presentation view. Good afternoon, folks. Hope everyone's having a nice middle of the week. So I'm going to start off talking about the Lafargue Clinic. I might alternate during the clinic sometimes during the presentation and my pronunciation of Hilde Mosse's name, because I encountered during the last 20 years people who've alternately called her Mosse and other people have called her Mosse, depending on, I guess, how German they were. So occasionally I'm going to try to stick to one, and I'll choose today Mosse, but I might every now and then slip into Mosse because I have met people who had encountered her and actually met her who referred to her as Dr. Mosse. So hopefully I can keep it consistent. So on March 1946, we get the creation of a very unique outpatient clinic in Central Harlem, the Lafargue Mental Hygiene Clinic. It was open on Tuesday and Thursday nights from 6 to 8 o'clock between 1946 and 1958. And during that period, it offered psychotherapy, short-term psychotherapy, regardless of a patient's ability to pay or their race. The clinic was headed by two Jewish American psychiatrists, Dr. Frederic Wertham and Dr. Hilde Mosse. And it was staffed entirely by an interracial group of volunteers. No one was paid, but almost all of them were professionally accredited. The majority of the staffers were themselves anti-racist, who assumed that the Black psyche was really no different in function than a white psyche, which was very revolutionary for the period. This kind of psychiatric universalism, if you will, sort of was a new approach, a new assumption, given that there were plenty of other psychiatrists, even in New York City, who still clung to a belief in biologically based racial differences in psychological functioning well into the 20th century, going into the late 20th century. So for these anti-racists at Lafargue, treating emotionally ill African Americans in Harlem like they were other human beings, in the phrase that Wertham used to use a lot, that required a very particular brand of psychiatry that was kind of designed for that assumption that Wertham liked to call social psychiatry. So in his version of the psychodynamic approach, which he labeled social psychiatry, Wertham and his fellow clinicians try to help patients to essentially cope with their immediate social circumstances rather than try to rummage through their past for unresolved psychosexual conflicts. So they use psychodynamic concepts, but they weren't doing that deep dive to try to find out, how much of an Oedipus complex did you have and have to repress. So in terms of my talk today, I'm going to be focusing on the origin of this institution and paying close attention to the relationship between the community itself in Harlem and the clinic. So during the nearly 13-year career of the Lafargue Mental Hygiene Clinic, this free clinic was much more than just an intervention imposed on Harlem by well-meaning outsiders. It was actually fairly integrated into the life of the African-American community itself. So, I mean, yes, undeniably, medical humanitarianism did help create Lafargue Clinic, but forces within Harlem itself helped to create and sustain it. The clinic was a result in many ways of an intersection between radical Black intellectuals, the activist Black church, and a Black public increasingly open to what psychiatry in the psychodynamic era had to offer. So although the clinic was really the brainchild of this leftist cadre of Black intellectuals working with Dr. Mosse and Dr. Wertham, the clinic would physically not have been created or not have survived without the support of a large and socially active Black church community in Harlem. So the progressive African-American pastor, Reverend Shelton Held Bishop, in his largely Caribbean-American parish at St. Philip's Protestant Episcopal Church, created a really a niche for the Lafargue Clinic in Central Harlem, since it operated out of the basement of the community center of St. Philip's Protestant Episcopal Church, one of the largest churches actually in the United States. So rather than interpret this secular psychiatric clinic as, as a potential competitor for the hearts and minds of his parishioners, Reverend Bishop actually embraced this politically radical project as a tool that the post-war Black church could use to address the social internal needs of not only his flock, but Harlem's Black population in general. So even more importantly, the Farch Clinic's Black patients and their families really helped to shape the culture and operation of the institution. I'm going to, throughout, pepper in as much as I can, kind of the perceptions and experiences of patients that I was able to get access to through the Schomburg Center's files on the Lafargue Clinic. And I'm also going to take a look at kind of the close of the paper, take a look at the social psychiatry approach, this kind of radically humanist approach that Mosse and Wertham had employed at the clinic, which really was in many ways an intersection between psychiatry and then anti-racist politics. And in many ways that was, the Lafargue Clinic's kind of lasting legacy. So let me start off with kind of the intellectual milieu in which this clinic kind of developed. By the early 1940s, some folks in Harlem had already turned their attention to the racial injustice within the mental health care system. There were rising juvenile delinquency rates during the early 40s. A wartime coalition of local Harlem leaders called the Citywide Citizens Coordinating Committee for Harlem had developed. They were calling for, and they then enlisted other outsiders from other parts of Manhattan, especially folks who were in the LaGuardia administration or had connections to it, kind of contacted them to try to call for an increase of psychiatric services to fight delinquency. So New York City did during this period, kind of partly in reaction to this Citywide Citizens Coordinating Committee for Harlem's call to arms to try to combat allegedly rising delinquency rates in Harlem. There were some experiments, psychiatric experiments that were created in the schools and the courts, but they were very short-lived. There were very few, other than those experiments, there were very few mental resources that were really open to both Black adults in Manhattan and their families. There were two, of course, public hospitals available. Harlem Hospital had an insufficient mental hygiene clinic at the time, run by Dr. Harold Ellis. Bellevue had its psychiatric ward, but Bellevue Psychiatric Ward had an absolutely abysmal reputation in Harlem as a fairly racist place. I remember reading one newspaper account where a local in Harlem told the reporter, people don't walk in there, they have to be carried in there. It is not a place that people wanted to go. So because Bellevue, unfortunately, remained the primary source of outpatient psychiatric diagnosis and treatment, despite being so far downtown from uptown, Harlem really could only expect its mental ills to multiply until something was done to provide local access on at least a less racist basis. So to fill this kind of mental health void, several concerned Harlemites themselves decided to help create their own community-based outpatient services. There are actually two that developed at roughly the same time. Different parts of Harlem. One was in the North Side up on 150th, and the other course over on 133rd, that being Lafargue. But 1946 saw the creation of the Northside Child Guidance Clinic up on 150th. They were not identical institutions, Lafargue Mental Hygiene Clinic and Northside Child Guidance and Testing Center. Northside Center was a brainchild of pioneering African-American psychologists and civil rights activists, Dr. Kenneth and Dr. Mamie Clark. It was different in Lafargue in that it primarily served children. And it was not, although for a brief time it was organized, it had essentially run by a psychiatrist hired by the Clarks. They opted out of that model by the 1950s and went to more of a team-based model, which was less hierarchical and less devoted psychiatry. It provided more of a wider range of educational, mental health, reading disability services, testing for reading disability. So a wider range of services. But in contrast, Lafargue Clinic was a psychiatric clinic, and it was a psychiatric clinic for the family. It was a psychiatric clinic for single people. It was a psychiatric clinic for children. It was a psychiatric clinic for everyone. So it wasn't a child specialty center. So although the clinic's primary founder and Lafargue's primary founder and its chief clinician were not from Harlem themselves, and they weren't Black, that being Dr. Wertham and Dr. Mosse, several local leaders and notables played a vital role in creating and organizing this psychiatric alternative. So one of them, as we're going to see as we're going along, is actually Richard Wright. And we'll get into his connection to this in a minute. So sometime between late 1945 and early 1946, Dr. Frederic Wertham had a white psychiatrist, German Jewish origin. He had a very fateful discussion with two young Black intellectuals about Harlem's psychiatric needs. Wertham at the time was a chief psychiatrist at Queens General Hospital. He recently had been at Bellevue and left under he was a difficult person to work with, and he did not like working there for a variety of reasons. And so he did end up at Queens General Hospital as a chief psychiatrist there. He was a real pioneer in forensic psychiatry and child psychopathology, and not surprisingly was really troubled by what he had been hearing about Harlem's apparent juvenile delinquency problem. But his interest in emotional well-being and treatment of Black Americans began in the 1920s when he was at Johns Hopkins' famed Phipps Clinic in Maryland. And there he witnessed Jim Crow for the first time, and he saw it in operation not just within the city of Baltimore, but also within the Phipps Clinic itself. His kind of education, if you will, between 1939 during that period, kind of in the 1920s, into how racial discrimination and segregation impacted the mental health system. He brought that with him too, that recognition that this was a thing, that what we would call racial trauma, that he was beginning to see this was a thing. And this continued while he was working in Bellevue prior to getting work at Queens General. At Bellevue, before he took the work, he worked at Bellevue from 1933 to 1939. And while he was there, he quickly learned in his own, this is a quote directly from him, that the whole problem of childcare, including psychiatry, is shot through with racial discrimination. And he just saw this confirmed by working with essentially racist fellow clinicians. The head of the adolescent ward was an unrepentant racist, as well as several of the other several of the other major psychiatrists on board. So almost immediately, he's appalled, and he begins petitioning in the 30s LaGuardia's administration to build adequate psychiatric services in Harlem so Black folks can avoid going to Bellevue. They didn't have to travel downtown to this dreaded place. His proposal never came to fruition for several reasons I can explore later in the discussion. But instead, after getting up essentially a brick wall every time he tried to approach the LaGuardia administration or some of LaGuardia's his allies within the hospital system and the children's court system and the school system, said he got tired of butting his head up against the wall. Once he left Bellevue, he turned to Harlem itself for perhaps a way to kind of inject more psychiatric services, especially of an anti-racist kind, into Harlem. He turned to two folks who were also interested in this as well, Richard Wright and Earl Brown. For many of you probably familiar, Richard Wright, the acclaimed novelist. Earl Brown was also an aspiring politician in Democratic politics in New York, as well as a journalist for the New York Amsterdam News and occasionally for Life magazine. The three of them agreed that Harlem really needed locally based mental health care more than any place else. They were both all three really were in accord of this. These local intellectuals were all, especially Wright, were convinced that the oppressive forces of slum living and racism had really harmed the collective psyche of African Americans in predominantly Black segregated urban neighborhoods. And so Wright in particular had really been thinking and writing about the psychological consequences, the emotional scars in his terminology of being Black in America since the late 30s. He and Brown were not alone in this. And so that's partly why Wertham was able to have this conversation with them, because they were able to articulate these ideas in ways that could resonate with psychiatrists and resonate with lay people. They've been really ruminating and thinking about this and writing about this for a while. As historian Gabriel Mendez and NYU comparative literature professor Jay Garcia have demonstrated, Wright had been engaging with a number of Black intellectuals about this topic for a while, including sociologist Horace Caton Jr., who wrote in the year of Lafargue's creation that Jim Crow racism's impact on Black mental health was so pervasive that, in his view, it required, quote, a psychological approach to race relations, unquote. And so Wright's talking to folks like this and his own theories about the Black psyche, which were probably most brilliantly expressed in his 1940 novel Native Son, and then his 1945 semi-autobiographical novel Black Boy. His ideas, they were so astute and innovative that anti-racist psychiatrists like Wertham eventually adopt them. Wertham absolutely makes no bones about it that he had adopted some of the ideas that he had gleaned about the Black psyche from reading Richard Wright. And so Wright thought that scientists and physicians have long been wrong about the Black mind. He believed that the emotional lives of Blacks and whites were not fundamentally different by nature. And it comes across very clearly in the essay that precedes Native Son. Instead, Wright was of the conviction, and Wertham shared this, that humans were born with the same basic drives, the same psychogenic raw material. He's very influenced by psychodynamic theory. So what was different about a Black psyche, if there was something different, was that every social environment, according to Wright, placed its own stamp upon our common human psychic stuff. And in his word, it ended up, quote, creating types of personalities whose existence ignored racial and national lines of demarcation. Demonstrating this point, Wright argued that the conditions of life under which Negroes, in his terminology, quote, under which Negroes are forced to live in America have warped, unquote, warped their human personalities in harmful directions. So that kind of idea that we today refer to as racial trauma was one that Wright was articulating, that racism had, that racism had in fact warped Black personalities, producing nervousness, anxiety, instability, antisocial behavior, in disproportion to their numbers in the population, because they were dealing with a social force that the white population did not have to deal with, this extra stressor, creating a disproportionate amount of anxiety and other mental ills. So through the fictional character of Bigger Thomas in Native Son, Wright's book Native Son, it kind of explored how how institutional racism had emotionally twisted kind of young Black men into potentially explosive criminal powder kegs. So not just an alarmist, Wright really believed that these powder kegs could be emotionally salvaged, that the psychic imprint of racism in slum living did not have to be permanent. It did not have to be a kind of a permanent mark. So according to Wright, psychiatry offered an important tool. He was really convinced of that at the time, that an important tool against the power of repressive conditions to imprint themselves on people. And so Wright, who had undergone psychotherapy himself, was thoroughly convinced that the mind of an African American was just as human and therapeutically reachable as any other mind. So with such faith in the power of psychiatry, Wright argued that, Harlem's high rate of juvenile delinquency, he believed that it was, quote, the product of an almost total lack of community services to cope with the problems of Harlem's individuals. So he saw problems like juvenile delinquency or crime. He saw these things as the result of unaddressed, disproportionate mental health disparities that were the result of the kind of institutional racism that African Americans had to deal with. So he believed, if Central Harlem had the right community services, perhaps some of the emotional effect of oppression could be undone or blunted. Wright and Brown, just like Wertham, did not really trust that New York City's politicians and bureaucracy were going to provide these services. So how the three men kind of met to be able to share these ideas is kind of a fascinating story that Mendez really covers well in Gabriel Mendez in his really fascinating book about the origin of the clinic under the strain of color, captures really well. If I could just kind of summarize it really quickly, I think he did a fabulous job on this. In 1941, Wertham had sent Wright a copy of his book, Dark Legend, which was a psychological profile of a white adolescent murderer. Wright was so impressed by it, he asked Wertham to help him prevent a man who was convicted of 2 murders, Clinton Brewer, who was an aspiring songwriter and composer. He wanted Wertham help him to testify on his behalf to help him to avoid a death penalty. Wertham did that, and he avoided the death penalty. Both Wertham and Wright were interested in really what had driven this very talented Black composer, what had psychologically driven him to kill. And so Mendez really captures how, from their shared interest in this case, the two men, then Wertham and Wright, kindled this friendship and a shared commitment to the idea that racism in the U.S. had really psychologically subjected Black communities such as Harlem to the kinds of disproportionately to stresses and strains that could push someone over the edge. And so for both men, one way to prevent more Clinton Brewers was to make mental health care more widely available in America's segregated Black living spaces. And so as Wertham later stated to the press, Harlem needed a psychiatric clinic because, quote, this is where the need is greatest. And so both of them really shared, and Earl Brown later shared that perspective. So at Brown and Wright's urging, Wertham decided to try and open up a low-cost psychiatric clinic in Harlem. The three men intended for the clinic staff and clientele to be interracial. It turned out that way. They began looking for clinicians of any race to help create this clinic. Dr. Gene Smith, a white pediatrician, Queens General Hospital. There's Wertham there. Queens General Hospital psychiatrist Dr. Hilde Mosse offered to co-found the clinic. She was a German Jewish immigrant like Wertham. She was a child psychiatrist with a very strong interest in learning disabilities. She eventually took a position in the 50s and the 60s with the New York Public School System's Bureau of Child Guidance. But at the time, she was a colleague of Wertham in Queens. Dr. Andre Tweed was also a colleague of Wertham's in Queens. He was the first Black psychiatrist, Dr. Andre Tweed, first Black psychiatrist ever appointed to staff of the New York City Department of Hospitals, and he was one of the first clinicians to offer his services as well. All this was on volunteer basis. No one involved with the clinic was paid. So this is all pro bono. So Wright, Brown, and Brown's wife, Wright, Earl Brown, and Brown's wife, Emma Brown, they then spread the word amongst their friends and then major African-American community leaders in Harlem that this clinic was going to become a reality. Almost immediately, the idea of a local outpatient clinic operating free of charge on an interracial basis, this resonated with Ralph Ellison of Invisible Man fame. Ellison was a fellow writer and friend of Richard Wright. He was still writing what would become the modern 20th century masterpiece, Invisible Man. He actively supported the creation of the clinic. And at that moment in time, Ellison was really still very sympathetic. This was his more radical part of his career as intellectual, and he was still very politically sympathetic to some of Wright's and Wertham's more leftist ideas about wealth inequality. Wright and Wertham had chosen to name the clinic after Karl Marx's African-descended son-in-law, Paul Lafargue, who Wertham really was fascinated by. Wright kind of, if I remember the story correctly, Wright was the one that introduced Wertham to the account of the man's life. And Wertham was really convinced that, quote, psychotherapy should not be limited to the wealthy alone. Discrimination and poverty causes as much mental confusion and neurosis as the bewilderment of possessing several $1 million, unquote. That was Wertham. So not surprisingly, these folks who were creating a clinic named after a member of the French Communist Party in the 19th century, and an interracial man as well as a physician. Wertham thought it fitting that they just recommend the clinic charge a nominal fee of 25 cents with a proviso that children and adults who couldn't afford that didn't have to pay. So for many, it was ostensibly a free clinic. So Wright and Wertham, they celebrated the kind of very subversive political implications of this kind of policy. Ellison was convinced at the time that mental health should be a right and not a privilege. And he even wrote later in an essay that he saw the proposed Lafargue Clinic as democratizing medicine in his terminology. Wright also celebrated kind of Lafargue as a way of liberating psychiatry from market forces. Even though he wasn't a communist, he was no longer a member of the Communist Party. Wright still was someone firmly believed in wealth redistribution at the time and kind of the pitfalls of capitalism. And so writing from France when he went to live in exile at the end of 1946, Wright lamented, quote, "There is nothing over here in France that is as radical and free as the idea we started up there in Harlem," unquote, referring to the clinic. So after several years of networking outside of Harlem and finding no philanthropic interest in their radical free proposal, as they kept telling people, describing it's radical and free. According to Wertham, folks just didn't think it was, white folks just didn't see that the necessity in it, or were bothered that this would be, a clinic for Black people. Isn't that reverse racism, or what they called reverse segregation at the time? So they had to deal with that kind of nonsense. And so where the help really comes from is the Black church itself. So without the help of St. Philip's Protestant Episcopal Church, There's no way this clinic would have existed. Wertham's 3 Harlem allies, Brown, Wright, and Ellison, urged him to approach Reverend Shelton Hale Bishop, pictured here, talking to Wertham's on the left, Reverend Shelton Hale Bishop's on the right. He was the African-American rector of St. Philip's Protestant Episcopal Church in Harlem, one of the largest churches in the United States. Wertham, in Wright's and Ellison's politics, did not repel this churchman at all. He eagerly embraced the proposal, and on March 6, 1946, he offered the basement of his parish house at 215 West 103rd Street between Convent and 7th to Wright, Wertham, and Mosse to use rent-free for their clinic space. So it was the basement of the parish house of St. Philip's Protestant Episcopal Church. Bishop and then a vestry woman in the parish, Marion Pettiford Hernandez, who was a nurse and district secretary for Planned Parenthood's Harlem unit, the Hannah Stone Center. They agreed to co-found this unlikely institution along with Mosse and then Wright and Ellison and Wertham. Bishop turned out to be the clinic's most vital co-founder in many ways. He really integrated this strange institution into the life of the parish and the life of the neighborhood more than really anybody else. Really was the most significant figure within this. Without him, there is no way this exists. And it makes sense that he would do this. He was a social activist himself. He was well known within New York City as someone who supported anti-racist causes for children. He had made a name for himself in 44 and 45 in the newspapers throughout the city because he had actually negotiated truces between 4 Harlem gangs between 40 and 44 and 45. Bishop really thought that the Lafargue Clinic was going to just be this perfect fit, and he was right with his martyr ministry, because his ministry is one in which he was beginning to recognize that he was out of his element with many of the racial discrimination, but they were also feared the possibility that a racist white psychiatrist might involuntarily commit someone who is healthy and Black. That was a well-founded fear. So he had folks coming to him who were sharing what he began to recognize as emotional problems coming through their pastor, because who else would they trust? So they were seeking counsel from Black family members or their local minister, and that's him. So I mean, people that they could trust with their deepest feelings. And he realized in many ways that he was out of his ken, he was out of his element. And so, as he said later, quote, "The clinic is an invaluable source of my ministry, and the parish is of great value to the community," unquote, because he could refer people who came to him with what he recognized as emotional issues. He could refer them to the clinic, and he himself became one of the most active sources of referrals for the clinic. I mean, he generated community interest and trust in his tiny basement clinic, not just through his individual consultations as a rector and pastor, but he also was someone whose sermons were reprinted sometimes in New York Times. He regularly was giving interviews, even in national magazines like Ebony. So he was a figure had a big pulpit, metaphorically speaking, not just a real pulpit within one of the largest churches in America, but also he was an activist minister who was willing to get that word out about things within his ministry that he thought would be useful. In this case, he saw the clinic as almost an annex to his ministry. So in terms of creating kind of the community of patients, they did draw on referrals from other mental health institutions, from the Veterans Administration, from the school system. Children only accounted for about 30% of cases. The majority of cases were actually adults. And one of the reasons why that is, I mean, there certainly were, when the clinic opened, here it is in the basement of the parish house. When it did open, there certainly were children, as I said, 30%. But keep in mind, It's open Tuesday and Thursday. It was open Tuesday and Thursday from 6 in the evening to 9. So you have to keep in mind that the people who are attending, from what we can see in the clinic records, they're working class and working poor primarily. And so parents who might want to actually send their children to this clinic, 6 to 9 is not a great time for many of them to actually accompany their children to this clinic. So we have, unfortunately, the decision that some of the parents had to make. We have in a record some tragic results where some kids attended the clinic unattended between 6 and 9 because their parents were working, or they had to attend to their own childcare, their other children at the time, or it's dinner time and they had to clean up a dinner, which can be extensive especially for hardworking mothers. Some children who are unaccompanied were unfortunately accosted between those evening hours, especially during the kind of daylight savings hours time of the year. So because of those reasons, it really wasn't practical for the clinic to really serve a large child population. So there were children there, but only about 30%. The bulk were actually adults. So this picture is more representative of the clinic itself, in that adults were the folks that were going to it. So in terms of actually the kind of care that people were getting or what they actually were receiving, Mosse and Wertham refer to it as social psychiatry. It was revolutionary. It really was an approach where they actually applied psychodynamic theories to the cases of Black patients without making any adjustment for race on one hand. And on the other hand, they really turned away from kind of psychodynamic theories, emphasis on kind of early childhood and psychosexual trauma, and turned away from that to kind of exploring how to help people deal with immediate stressors, especially immediate stressors of an additional kind that come from living in slums, at the term at the time, slums, and what today we would call institutional racism. They would use other different terms for that during the period, like Jim Crow and so forth. So this is a very radical clinic in that social psychiatry was, the social psychiatry was a new kind of approach, and really was designed to kind of consider the patient's personal mental health needs in light of their lives within the often very difficult environs of central Harlem's living spaces, as well as what Wertham called kind of the free-floating hostility of racial discrimination. That was his terminology. It was really an apt way of kind of describing kind of what today we call racial trauma. So central to kind of this idea is that Wertham and Mosse staff realized that many of their patients suffered from institutional neglect, that a lot of the problems they're dealing with could be handled or were being handled in other parts of New York City if you happen to be white. So, and these included things they were seeing as well. So we were coming in for psychodynamic or mental health issues, but they also began to realize people were coming in with more long-term or severe mental illnesses, as well as physical problems that were going undiagnosed because of the larger medical neglect of the Black community. So people were coming in initially, I'm depressed, I have anxiety. They would use terms like nervous breakdown, or I'm feeling nervous, or a variety of terminology for expressing kind of internal, problems with interior states. But they'd also find out, oh, this person actually has a kidney problem, or this person has, severe menstrual bleeding. In one case, a woman came in and just excessive menstrual bleeding that she'd been dealing with for a while, and no one had diagnosed it. And they simply sent her to a place downtown, got her tested, and then got her treatment. So in many cases, they were serving as a clearinghouse a community center for people for a variety of issues, not just mental health, but also other medical issues that were not being addressed because of the larger medical neglect rife throughout the healthcare system, not just the mental health care system, but the healthcare system within New York City. So, I mean, there are patients coming in with untreated biomedical problems. There are patients also coming in with problems that were of what today we call kind of a social work kind. Wertham, this is part of social psychiatry, that they actually believe that rather than simply a mere supplement to psychotherapy, social welfare assistance, social work was an integral component of their therapy. So they had cases where the Lafargue staff members really hoped to relieve some of their patients' emotional problems by addressing the immediate social causes of kind of the anxieties that they were seeing. I'll give you just one example before I move on to kind of to the end of the talk. There was one woman who complained of having back pains, muscle tightness, and an inability to, in her terms, relax. She was a separated mother of 3 boys, 2 of whom had been diagnosed by the clinic previously with behavior problems. So over the course of 3 years in which she visited the clinic, this young woman lived at 3 different addresses and experienced difficulty securing public assistance and permanent housing for her family in New York. Eventually, the staff at Mosse realized that what was really causing this anxiety was the instability in her life generated by getting the runaround by the social welfare system and the housing authority. So what they did instead was they determined that it was her lack of suitable housing and the kind of red tape she was experiencing with New York welfare that caused her anxiety and her psychosomatic complaints. So Lafargue's social work, one of their social workers suggested to Mosse that, quote, the behavior problems her boys are developing may be traced to housing problems, unquote. And so Lafargue staff at Mosse's insistence intervened on behalf with these agencies. And then Mosse and 2 social workers helped this woman to file a suit with the New York Housing Authority, and they did assist her in acquiring beds and furniture once they got a permanent dwelling for her. They also worked with the Department of Welfare to help her to locate her estranged husband, in the process to help her to navigate New York City's really like labyrinth-like public assistance bureaucracy in order to not only get him to help to pay for the kids, but to get New York City to give her the public assistance or to facilitate the public assistance that her children were qualified to receive. So that really gives you a sense of kind of the parameters of social psychiatry. It wasn't just a way to deal with, your Oedipus complex. It was a way to handle a whole wide range of problems, more of not holistic, because they weren't holistic. This is still the allopathic medical tradition. But it was a recognition that within the matrix of problems that were confronting someone Black in Harlem, that there were more issues at stake than just, did your mommy hold you enough as a kid? They were finding that there was what we would call racial trauma. There was far more of that and socioeconomic traumas that were at the root of many of the problems they were seeing. And so you would also imagine that a group like this would also want to find ways to contribute on a national level to the discussion about mental health and its relationship to racial discrimination. And you'd be right. You'd be absolutely right. That takes us to, let me get to the next slide here. That takes us to this slide here. Those of you who have, a fascination, with American history, you're probably very familiar with Brown versus Board of Ed, the 1954 Supreme Court case in which racial segregation in public schools was declared unconstitutional. What you might not be aware of is Lafargue Clinic played a role in this. Lafargue Clinic staff did make a concerted effort to find ways to contribute on a national level. And one of the ways to this discussion of what today we call racial trauma. And it did so through participating, not just in this case, but in others. In 1951, the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund, which was handling the case or the movement in the courts to bring a case, eventually, which would be Brown versus Board of Ed in Topeka, Kansas, looking for a case to bring to Supreme Court to test the constitutionality of separate but so-called equal education, which we all know was unequal. So in 1951, Jack Greenberg of the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund had asked Wertham to testify in court against the health effects, about the health effects of segregated schooling. Wertham was more than happy. So he agreed he would have the Lafargue Clinic, which usually meant, for all intents and purposes, throughout all of this, the person, yes, one of the the person who's the kind of the face of the clinic is Wertham, but the actual physician in charge, the person who is there every Tuesday and Thursday night handling the bulk of cases, Dr. Hilde Mosse. It was her. So she was the one doing the bulk of this as well. Wertham agreed that he would have, which means Dr. Mosse, investigate the psychological harm that Jim Crow education inflicted on the students in segregated Delaware. So on 5 separate days, 13 students from Delaware made it up from Wilmington to Lafargue Clinic. Wertham and Dr. Mosse observed these 13 students from segregated public schools, and they came to the conclusion after these 5 separate observation days, came to the conclusion that Jim Crow segregation constituted a public health threat on a psychological level to Black and white children. And so between 51 and 54, the NAACP used Wertham's testimony, both public and both oral testimony and written testimony. They used his testimony to successfully argue the unconstitutionality of racial segregated schools, to argue that in both Delaware's state court of Chancery as well as in the U.S. Supreme Court case of Brown versus Board of Ed. So, of course, depicted here, Dr. Kenneth and Mamie Clark's famous Dowell's test were definitely a more well-known tool, probably the more famous tool that the NAACP's legal team used in the fight against segregated schools. But civil rights lawyers, Jack Greenberg, and even Thurgood Marshall himself later acknowledged the vital role that the Lafargue Clinic actually played in fighting this legal battle against Jim Crow education. So this, I'm sorry, it's running a little long. There's just so much about this clinic. Despite its remarkable legacy, its remarkable run as this underfunded, little known, volunteer-run free clinic. Lafargue Clinic today, of course, no longer exists. It shuttered its doors in '59. There are several reasons that there's several major scholars of Lafargue Clinic, and one of them is Dr. Gabriel Mendez, and on several points we do agree. One of them is kind of factors accounting for the closure, some of which I'll explore here. First, between 54 and 57, there were new state and local regulations regarding tax exemptions and public funding for mental health clinics. And that prevented the clinics from, and these new regulations were so harsh, they prevented the clinic from actually securing tax exemptions and public funding. So they were on their own between 54 and 57, really on their own. The second thing is Shelton Hale Bishop, the Reverend, the sympathetic pastor who was absolutely critical to this clinic. Without him, it wouldn't have existed in the basement of his parish house. He gave them rent-free space all the way up until he retires in 57. Once he retires, the new rector in charge, Reverend M. Warren Weston was not disinterested in Harlem's mental health needs. He actually was on the board of directors of the Northside Center for Child Development on West 150th. It, at the time, was one of the clinics that actually did meet the the state and local regulations so it could get tax exempt status, it could get public funding. It was definitely the best funded psychiatric service in Harlem. Reminiscing the 70s, Wertham recalled that when the clinic shut down in 59, it's part because he couldn't convince Weston to support an institution that would not be as financially stable as Northside. Northside had the tax exemptions. It was able to get public funding. It also had a fairly large source of private funding. And because of that, Weston just said, I don't see the need for it. So the third thing was that also Wertham, one of the reasons why there wasn't public funding coming in anymore, or donations, was that Wertham had been a leading public intellectual between about his real claim, his real moment of notoriety, if you will, is between roughly about 1948 and 1954. It's the height of the Cold War crusade against comic books, in which parents groups were claiming that comic books were harming young minds. And so donations for the clinic actually poured in between 48 and 54. So when the movement subsides in 54, fewer donations come in. And that's exactly the moment when the clinic actually is no longer, the new state regulations and local regulations take away its tax exempt status and take away any opportunity for it to get public funding. Right at the moment when its chief source of private funding, donations for the comic book crusade, had just disappeared. So without outside funding and support of the Harlem church that even housed it, I mean, its rector didn't even want it there, its days were clearly numbered. And it closed up in 1959. But even when it closed up, it still had a waiting list. So its legacy is a radically anti-racist one. It served over 2,000 patients for 13 years. It offered affordable, relatively humane outpatient psychotherapy at a time when Black access to such care was limited. The clinic maintained an openly interracial policy. It blended social work, short-term psychiatric care in your neighborhood, all things that anticipated the community psychiatry movement and the kind of the biopsychosocial model of medicine. It was founded and operated by African Americans and Jewish Americans, both men and women, at a time when psychiatry is still male dominated and racial integration was rare. It was named in honor of Karl Marx's mixed race communist son-in-law. And this Lafargue Clinic operated as a collective where no one was paid and some patients received medical care for free. It was founded by people who lived in and cared deeply about Harlem. It was nurtured by the Black church. It was kept alive by the patient community that used it so often. It maintained a months-long waiting list until it closed its doors in 59. When it closed its doors, apparently the waiting list was still 3 to 4 months long. So although we are now firmly ensconced in 21st century with our world of biopsychiatry and the psychopharmacological approach, which is at my pharmacy school, which is still all the rage, racial disparities still persist in mental health. In some ways, it's only gotten worse. Pushed by the anti-racist George Floyd murder protests, the wave of sentiment across the world is not just here. Many mainstream mental health organizations in 2020 and entering 2021, including the American Psychological Association, have finally recognized something that Lafargue Clinic founders knew about back in 46, but didn't have the words for: racial trauma. The American Psychological Association finally, in 2020, officially admitted racial trauma is a thing. The results of the stresses that result from kind of a state of hypervigilance living in a racist society. It's a real phenomena that has led African Americans to live in this psychological state of hypervigilance that we now know is correlated with a wide range of physiological conditions that disproportionately impact the Black community, from elevated cortisol levels to high blood pressure, to heart disease, to diabetes and obesity. All of them do have a racial trauma link. So besides the APA's recognition of racial trauma, a national policy commitment to finding solutions to this disparities are not really moving apace. But at a grassroots level, Black community health advocates and professionals in cities like Philadelphia, Rochester, New York, have already begun kind of exploring ways to address racial trauma and its effects on overall physical health for Black Americans, and to try to find ways to redistribute community resources to focus attention on the disparities facing African Americans. And so for the Lafargue founders, who also took it upon themselves to address the psychological effects of being a Black American without public support, I think that story probably be all too familiar to them. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Thank you, Dennis, for that.
Stop sharing my screen here.
No problem. Now that we're back, Martin Summers, I was going to invite you to respond, and then we'll move on to questions as planned.
So thank you, Michael, and thank you, Dennis, for that very wonderful presentation. I want to thank Michael for inviting me to participate and engage with you. And I just have really, I know that there's people who are probably chomping at the bit to ask you more questions about Lafargue. So I really am just going to make two brief comments and then turn things back over to Michael. One of the things I want to say, and not just to you, but also to the audience, is I think it's really hard to overstate the service that you've provided to the history of psychiatry. And those who are interested in the history of psychiatry. I know that when I entered into the field, it's been 20 years now, and started working on my project that would eventually turn into Madison City of Magnificent Intentions, which is a history of St. Elizabeth's Hospital, a federal mental institution in Washington, D.C., and its relationship to the African American community. When I turned to the existing histories of psychiatry in the United States, there just weren't any, or I mean, there were very few. You could probably count them on one hand that were actually utilizing race as a category of historical analysis, right? So and you probably had to do this too, I had to turn to the histories of colonial psychiatry really to get a sense of how historians were writing about psychiatry, and again, really centering race and ideas about racial difference to the histories that they produce. And so, you know, you're one of this kind of pioneering group of historians who really, again, centered race or placed race, I should say, at the center of the story. And I think we all owe you a debt of gratitude for that. I mean, historians, you know, up until about 15 years ago, weren't even really talking about racialist psychiatry, right? And they weren't acknowledging that for the psychiatric profession, the mentally ill white person was really the normative subject of psychiatric intervention, right? They weren't really doing that. They weren't acknowledging or really delving into it to any great extent that psychiatrists began, I should say, with the presumption that Blacks and whites had fundamentally different psyches, right? And so your history of racial liberalism in psychiatry in New York, and specifically Lafargue, and the ways in which they reflect this kind of turn to a universalist psychiatry is really incredibly important. And I think the other thing, and that your work is really helps us understand and begins to allow us to shift and have a different kind of understanding or a different narrative is the relationship of African Americans to psychiatry, right? And so, you know, as you pointed out earlier in your talk, the Lafargue Clinic is really a product of a collaboration between two institutions that we would normally assume were antagonistic, right? And that is the psychiatric profession and the church. But in some ways, the only reason that is remarkable is because we have this presumption, right? That those two have always existed in this kind of tense relationship, or as I said, this antagonistic relationship, right? One kind of institution that encourages people to kind of think about themselves and their relationship to others, within this very religious framework or spiritual framework, and one that encourages people to kind of think about themselves, and kind of orient themselves in the world in relationship to others, and to kind of think about how to deal with their emotional stress or their emotional problems through, as you point out, a radical humanist paradigm or framework. But as your history, I think, shows, and as I think more historians are beginning to really deal with this, is that that's a incorrect narrative, right? That's an incorrect out of his, and that in fact the church and the psychiatric profession in many ways have been compatible, right? They're not necessarily incompatible. And then the other thing I'll just say, again, building on this point about African Americans' relationship to psychiatry, is the importance of understanding or recognizing that African Americans have always been seekers of treatment, right? They've been, and that reflects a real kind of agency on, the African Americans have not just been kind of these victims of or objects of medicalization or institutionalization, but that in fact African Americans have engaged the psychiatric profession in ways, and often done so on their own terms, right? Both kind of organizationally, as you talked about the role that these community organizations in Harlem played in that turn towards kind of racially liberal psychiatry in New York, but also individuals, right? And individuals seeking out treatment for their emotional and psychological stress. And again, I think that this is really an important corrective to what has been kind of a conventional wisdom about African Americans as having some kind of natural or inherent hostility towards the psychiatric profession. So I'll leave it there, and I'm sure that as I said, members of the audience would love to get in on the conversation.
Yeah, Martin, I just wanted to ask you, so I know you work a lot with the history of Black mental health care in the United States since the Lafargue up through the decades to now. And I was just going to ask quickly if you could comment, in a way the Lafargue Clinic points out there is no such thing as a colorblind therapy. And do you feel in the work you do that this understanding has improved or not since that time? I'd just be curious.
The understanding that there is no colorblind therapy.
Right, correct.
So you mean amongst, like from a contemporary perspective, or?
From a contemporary perspective.
Well, I'm not quite sure. I mean, I know what you mean by has it improved. So
okay. So what I would say, I should clarify it myself. Mm-hmm. So that blacks and people of color, some mental health issues come directly related to their treatment in a racist society.
Oh, I see. Mm-hmm.
That's what I meant.
Yeah, well, no, absolutely. I mean, and this is one of the things, Dennis really dealt with this very well, and that there's the shift towards thinking about mental illness not as a product of psychosexual conflict or this kind of intrapsychic conflict, but rather it's the product of these external stressors, right? Of which racism is only one, and certainly it's the social psychiatrists of the mid 20th century that really began to develop that consensus. And I think you certainly see that persisting into the period that I look at, which is the 1960s and the 1970s. And so you certainly have community mental health activists who are addressing racial trauma. But what's really interesting, and particularly, one of the, I'm actually working on this project that at this point looks at 3 cities, Boston, Chicago, and Washington, D.C. And I've been doing a lot of research in Chicago, and there was the Woodlawn Mental Health Center, which is on the south side of Chicago, which got its start, actually. It was supported by the Woodlawn organization, which was a very radical, right, militant civil rights organization that had connection to Saul Alinsky, right? And so there was actually quite a bit of discussion when 3 white psychiatrists from Yale came to Chicago wanting to start this mental health clinic, to actually look at the relationship, right, between substandard delivery of services, overcrowded housing, right? All of these urban ills, right? They really wanted to look at the role that the urban crisis was playing in mental illness among low-income residents of inner cities, and so members of the Woodlawn organization were receptive to the clinic, but they were also very wary about, quote, what they called medicalizing, right? The problems that were experienced by African Americans, because in some ways it was transforming these individuals into patients and framing it as an internal problem rather than something that was exogenously produced, right, by political and economic structures. And so they were somewhat they were circumspect, right, about not just addressing emotional and psychological stress among Black residents on the South Side, and particularly Black youth among the South Side, solely through a psychiatric or a psychotherapeutic paradigm, but rather they also recognized that they had to address kind of institutional racism and systemic racism, and that they could only do this through political engagement. So in some ways, they looked at psychotherapy as a route to the further development of kind of a political consciousness. And so yeah, I think there's even as African Americans and Black grassroots activists have recognized the role that racial trauma plays. They've recognized, I should say, that it's also important to address these at a political level, right? Just not at a therapeutic level.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So I'll go through some of the questions now. There's a lot here, and I'll read through them. So the first for Dennis Doyle, and I realized, by the way, I should mention first, we're going late. I'm aware of that. So we'll just go on through the questions, and if people wish to leave, of course they can leave. So we'll go on as long as there's questions and there's time. So for Dennis Doyle, first of all, though, Martin, maybe you know these answers to some of these too. Wertham is also infamous for his ideas on popular culture and violence, movies, comic books. Did Wright and Wertham dialogue about this? And is this discussed in any of the sources?
It's really connected to his ideas about how the environment harms people on a psychological level. So he saw comic books as part of mass media. And he saw mass media as an environmental, essentially a stimulus. And then he saw discrimination, Jim Crow laws. He saw them also as environmental stimuli that you have to respond to. And that for him, he didn't see the campaign to prevent children from getting access to comic books as being really fundamentally different from the campaign to desegregate schools. he literally didn't think they were different, because he did see them as preventing children being harmed by a preventable environmental stressor. And since he was someone who is really, I think Mosse got it right. She once said offhandedly that he had spent his career trying to merge Freudianism with Marxism. I mean, he wasn't a Marxist, and that's why he was able to get, very conservative white parents to support his crusade in the 40s and 50s. But he was someone who had, he wrote in the New Republic, and when he wrote New Republic with a very socialist perspective. So he was someone trying to blend the two. And so, yes, he wasn't going as far as say like the Frankfurt School, but he did see mass culture as a problem on the level of kind of institutional racism, because they both saw them as these very harmful conditions that society didn't necessarily have to have. He even saw violence itself as something that wasn't inherent in the human psyche. He did not believe with Freud that aggression was actually normal or natural. He believed that actually it was produced and generated, that in fact it was an ill, and that you could cure it. So he thought anything that could prevent, anything that was violent and that created violence, whether racial violence, whether it's the violence of capitalism, he saw those as things you needed to try to prevent children getting exposed to so they could create a better world. In many ways, he was very Platonic. He did really imagine, he was a big fan of Plato's Republic. He really is a big fan of Plato. And so he did really think we are capable of becoming our best selves. So there's a very idealistic element to him that a lot of his conservative fans in the 50s really didn't see, because they didn't really understand what was motivating him to support, on one hand, Brown versus Board of Ed, and then the Comics Code of America on the other, which censored, self-censored, was self-censorship within the comics industry. He supported both, and he saw them as analogous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know at the Leo Beck too, and that we have an interview with Hilde Mosse where she's also talking about comic books.
Oh wow! What
Yeah. I'll send you the information.
Oh, that'd be great. I know that she talked about it when she was working for the public school system. She actually in the 1960s, she did, it might have been like 67. She did an interview on a local radio station here in New York. I forget which one, where she actually had a confrontation with Stan Lee, Marvel Comics co-founder Stan Lee. And I got the transcript of it. I haven't heard it, but I got the transcript. It's amazing. It really is just butting heads, but they can't really see eye to eye, because Stan Lee is, he's the ultimate capitalist. He is the ultimate entrepreneur. He can't see it as a system. He just sees, oh, you just don't like free enterprise. So it's just, it's really interesting conversation, because they're talking at cross purposes and they can't even unpack each other's assumptions. It's so interesting.
So I know, Dennis, that you have to leave at 3:30, right? So, or Martin, sorry.
Martin does.
So I'll just put that out there. I'll say goodbye now because we're in the middle of questions. Stay as long as you can, but you're also welcome to leave. Thank you for being part of the conversation today. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Martin. I really appreciate it as well. Thank you for the kind words as well.
This is great. Yeah. No, I'm here for another couple minutes. So yeah.
All right. Let's see if I'll. Thank you for the fantastic overview, Dennis. In the photograph you shared, it looks like people are receiving assistance right next to the waiting area. I was curious about the level of privacy that was available for those seeking assistance at the clinic, and if this posed challenges.
That's really fascinating. So one of the things that Wertham caught on to this very quick, and everyone did. Everyone caught on to it very quick. It's a small space. I have the dimensions in one of my articles. I forget the dimensions. Because when I went over, I did go once over to see if it was still there, the space, but it was not accessible. This was 1999. I went over to St. Philip's. I can't remember the name of the director at the time, but he was really nice. He was shorter than me, which I always appreciate because I'm a very small person. So it's like, I immediately like this guy, fellow short guy. I couldn't get access to it, but he kind of affirmed that the space was so small, a very small space. So yeah, they had these dividers they set up between each of what became, imagine like a Dilbert style cubicle, like an office cubicle. That's where they were doing. So they have the intake, which would be done in one cubicle. They would have the actual therapy session done in another one. And then in a kind of room off to the side, that was kind of an anteroom. That essentially is the only space that had a bit of privacy. That space is where they did the kind of the team, say we called it a team meeting. They didn't have a name for it at that point, but it's where everyone gets together with Dr. Mosse or Dr. Mosse leading kind of the discussion. So you have the social worker there, the psychiatric social worker there, the initial caseworker, a psychologist. They're all there discussing a case and sometimes with a patient right there. But the waiting room, yeah, is just separated by dividers. And Wertham addressed this and he said, one of the things that, because he could hear everything going on, he said, they're talking amongst themselves. The waiting room was never quiet. The waiting room was always full of conversation. And he would hear things. And he actually, one article, he said, I think it was in Tomorrow Magazine, he said to I think it was Robert Bendiner who wrote the article. He said to Bendiner, they're probably doing more in that waiting room than in some of my sessions. They are talking through, hey, what are you here for? And they are sharing information that he said that they're almost, he didn't use this term, but when he described it, it sounded like they're almost doing a run through or dress rehearsal, almost how in a classroom we do the think, pair, share. It sounded like think, pair, share, where they were amongst their peers are discussing, hey, what are you here for? And then sharing terminology. And then they would come in. And I think that probably actually, I don't have any proof for this, but in the limited records I had access to, a number of the patients who are coming in at the same time discuss things using the same terms. I think it must have been a result of partially people rehearsing what they were going to say amongst themselves, in an organic fashion in this waiting room area. Because a lot of these folks, I mean, they're from the neighborhood. They know each other. There were a lot of parishioners, his own parishioners there. And I got confirmation of this. I never got to write it down, but I got access initially when there used to be access to it. Now you can't get access to it at Schomburg, but there used to be access to all the addresses and personal information for everyone who had ever gone through Lafargue Clinic, available at Schomburg. Thankfully, that stuff is not available because the first time I looked at it, it was the last time I looked at it. I didn't feel comfortable. I was like, I should never have been able to see this ever. And I'm glad no one else could see it. I didn't take anything. I didn't write nothing down because I knew when I was looking at it, I shouldn't be seeing this. So, but one thing I did note was how overwhelming the number of people on there were listed that they were from St. Philip's Protestant Episcopal Church, or had just been either Ed Younger, who was the head of the fund center there, or Mr. Rucker of Rucker Park fame, who was actually kind of a gym teacher at the St. Louis at the St. Philip's Protestant Episcopal Church Fund Center. He was the basketball coach, referred by him. You have all these different referrals. So these are all folks who have this community connection, and they don't feel the kind of stigma that you would anticipate. Oh, they're going to feel stigma. There wasn't. Wertham said you could hear them chatting the whole time, and he said they're talking about things. The only dynamic, though, he said, that I picked up on, it really only was there. The chatter was really only there when it was female dominant. When it was male dominant in the waiting room, there was less chatter. But when it was female dominant, they just let it open and they just talked, and there was a different gender dynamic. But since the bulk of the patients actually were female in terms of the breakdown, it probably means that the waiting room was probably a very convivial place most of the time. So I think they probably couldn't have heard what was going on in some of the other spaces because they were actively focused on each other, doing that kind of, you know, even when doing small talk, if you really are, and we've all been that, and, you know, those of you who've been in therapeutic sessions and you're waiting, if you're having a discussion with someone, you do exist in this kind of space where you've kind of, everything else is kind of funneled out, right? And the only person in front of you is there because you're so focused on getting everything right when you go into that. Because the problem for most of us who do have like anxiety and so forth is, am I going to tell them everything? Am I going to let them know everything? So you rehearse this. And so you get so if you have someone you're talking to, you're using them to help you rehearse what you're going to talk about and find out what's safe to talk about or what's normal, what's not normal. And they were doing this with a lot less reticence than I've encountered in any waiting room I've ever been in. So it's, I think, different because they were from the same community. They're from the St. Philip's Protestant Episcopal Church community.
I actually had a question too that was related to Martin Summers, who's leaving us now. So if the person who, I don't know if you have time because it really is 3:30, Martin, but the person is welcome to write me, Leo Beck Institute, and I can send it to you, Martin. Maybe that's the best way to go. Or do you have a few minutes?
What is the question? I mean, I can.
Okay, I'll read it quick. This is actually for both speakers. Have either of you encountered a use of photography images to reinforce racial stereotypes that subsequently affect diagnosis and treatment, i.e. portraying Black mental illness as more unruly and untreatable? I know this happened in colonial asylums, but wonder if this may have continued in places like St. Elizabeth's. That's why I...
Well, yeah, no, that's a fascinating question. So I can't say that there were specific photographs that were taken for for that particular purpose. I do think that there are existing photographs of patients at St. Elizabeth's that reflect how the psychiatric staff thought about Black patients, right, and Black mental illness. So, for instance, you see a lot of African American male patients in shots that where they're clearly either getting ready to work, right, or perform labor on the hospital campus, or they're taking a break from labor on the hospital campus. But likewise, you know, even though we know that African American women, for instance, were disproportionately subjected to hydrotherapy as a really kind of disciplinary type of therapy, right? That there aren't, at least I haven't seen. Well, and again, that reflects the assumption that African Americans are kind of African American mental illness is more abject, is more deviant, is more dangerous than white mental illness. You don't see any photographs. I haven't found any photographs of that, right? I've only seen photographs of the hydrotherapy facilities, not actual patients in the facilities. So, but no, that's a great question. I don't know if Dennis, if you've seen any photographs in your.
The only thing I think of is the mental hygiene film from 1947, The Quiet One. I had screened it once at the University of South Carolina for a group of Black Studies scholars. And they immediately pointed out that even though this is a film done to try to humanize Black juvenile delinquents as people who were suffering on a psychological level and then should be given sympathy as a result, the film did reinforce racist tropes. At one point, they showed children playing together, Black children playing in a forest, and they were clinging, hanging on trees. And immediately, some of the scholars in the room said, the very fact that they didn't edit that out and think that that was going to be a trigger for, African Americans, and a reinforcer for people who have this, already have these racial stereotypes about African Americans as being savage. The fact that that was in there gives you a sense of kind of it was done by these two well-meaning liberals, but it gives you a sense of kind of the blind spot that they actually had. And so in many ways that scene, and I'm very thankful to the scholars, because I had seen the film and I had seen it cursorily, but this is the first time I really sat and watched it. I was like, oh yeah, no, you guys are right. There it is. Bingo. So it led me to another dimension looking at this film, to kind of look at the blind spots of the well-intentioned people who are trying to humanize African Americans through film or through photographs, that even their blind spots could end up, their racist blind spots could end up on film without, not intentionally, but there it was. Their bias, they come out.
Yeah, there's certainly, and I do have to go, but there's certainly way more textual representations, right, of African American, mentally ill African Americans as particularly unruly, degraded, right? Again, deviant. So, but at least in the case of St. Elizabeth's, not very many photographic or So anyway, but thank you. And enjoy the rest of the panel. Thanks again, Dennis and Michael. And
thank
you, Martin.
Thanks. The rest of the questions are very particular to the clinic. So,
okay.
One person asked, was homosexuality considered or dealt with in any way at the clinic?
Yes.
Specifically, did individuals seek counseling or therapy related to their sexuality and or homosexuality?
Oh, yes. There's two types of cases, at least what I saw from the case files are extant. That doesn't mean there are other folks in different circumstances, but the circumstance I was seeing was usually a parent who suspected their child was homosexual, and they saw that again in the 50s as something that needed to be changed. There was a great book that came out a couple of years ago called Prescription for Heterosexuality, about kind of the medical profession's tendency to see homosexuality as something, even if they weren't psychiatrists, but tendency to see it as a problem that needed to be fixed. And so many of the parents were sending their kids who they suspected, they would use terms like, I think my kid is a sex pervert, or I think my kid is queer, or I think my kid is sex maniac, another term from the time period. And they would say, you get this sense that the children themselves weren't about this therapy. They were not excited about this. Whereas the parents who suspected really were kind of troubled and blaming themselves, because it's still that, especially these are mothers. And it's that blame the mother culture of that, of the 1940s and 1950s. It's always the mother's fault kind of perspective that psychoanalysis helped to reinforce. So a lot of them came in with this guilt that, oh, I caused this. We need to fix this. You guys need to fix this. And then there's also World War II veterans who had actually discovered the homosexuality, which is something, Alan Barabee had really, his pioneering work. I saw that confirmed, like constantly. There were World War II veterans showing up, confused that now, I have had I have these homosexual feelings, or I'm in a relationship that's heterosexual, but I don't want to be, and I'm not sure what to do. So you have folks at different levels of anxiety over this. Some of the patients, the adult patients, wanted to be quote unquote fixed. And then others just wanted to deal with the anxiety. It's like, I just want the anxiety to go away. I don't want the homosexuality to go away. I want the anxiety to go away. But, and this is probably an interesting point here. Mosse herself, again, her brother was gay. And so she was not unfamiliar with this. She had worked at another institution called the Quaker Readjustment Center, which was a institution in New York that tried to use psychiatry to rehabilitate homosexual men. But it did it from a more liberal understanding perspective. And that was kind of the goal of it. It was not to, as far, for the time period, they were not doing the kind of use of ECT, which is what some other folks were doing, using ECT and other kinds of aversive therapies to try to cure people. They were instead trying to get to people to a place where they would not be pursuing those kinds of behaviors the way they saw it, or indulging those tendencies and producing those behaviors, but doing a way in which they would feel no anxiety about it, that the absence of homosexual activity would not be something they would feel anxiety about. Still, that didn't work for most people. Obviously, that doesn't work. But Mosse was of that ken. And so she saw it as her duty is to try to help them to work through their homosexual feelings and see if they could resolve them. Mosse in Wertham always used the term resolution. They wanted to resolve the feelings. And that was very standard in psychoanalysis, because in psychoanalysis, essentially homosexual, despite the APA, including in DSM, that is a disorder, true psychoanalysts who were devotees of Freud, as were Mosse and Wertham, it's not an illness. They considered it a stage. And you just get arrested at that stage. That was the understanding of it. But it wasn't a disease in a sense of it's not on the level of schizophrenia. It wasn't on the level of, some kind of psychosis. But there were psychiatrists for whom it was. And Mosse was not one of them. But she was someone who did see it as something, a stage in which you were arrested that she needed to help you to resolve in order to get to a more mature stage. They considered heterosexuality within the Freudian frame is considered to be maturity. So yes, it is, from today's perspective, it's still troubling and disturbing. But within the perspective of the time, they didn't really see it as psychotic. They didn't really see it as an illness that needed to be, overcome. But they didn't either see it as part of your personality that you just needed to become more integrated with. They didn't see it that way. So as a stage, you needed to kind of learn to overcome in order to successfully repress.
I see. The next question. The clinic was founded not long after the 1943 riot in Harlem, and also, of course, the Second World War and the Holocaust. They're curious whether the clinic and this meeting of Black intellectuals and German Jewish refugees, if there's any research done that you've done perhaps on parallels and connections between them because of both experiencing racism.
Mendez, I really urge you guys, if you haven't read it, I reviewed it. I actually reviewed it for, so full disclosure, I reviewed it for a journal. It's Under the Strain of Color by Gabriel Mendez. It is a story of essentially it's the origin story of the clinic. And it is one of the best kind of collected biographies because it looks at the biography of Wertham and Wright in particular, an intersection of, it's a biography of a relationship, really what the book is. And so absolutely essential to that is the story of these two men who are migrants, one from Germany, one from Mississippi. Both have left behind oppression. And so he puts it squarely in that perspective. So if you want to find out more about that, his is the perfect book because his real strength is that ability to really examine one-on-one relationships between people. I'm more of a social historian, so it's more of the structures and the kind of arrangements and culture. It's sort of more my thing, but he's really good at kind of really digging into the history of a relationship between two people. It's amazing in that way. Yeah. I think that book would answer that question. I could give you a more in-depth answer, but I wouldn't be doing his book the service.
It is good. I've read it too. The next question, thanks for all this so far. Do we know roughly how many people were seen over the years and what average length of treatment, number of sessions would have been? Or profiles of those seeking mental health support? So questions about patient numbers.
We don't have precise numbers, but it's the best that I could estimate was somewhere around 2,000 probably. About 2,000 patients. And the length of time was short. It was very short term. I would say the bulk of people were doing anywhere from a few weeks to a few months. There were some long timers, but it was really very short term. And the reason why is that they had such an extensive waiting list that they couldn't really do an extensive kind of, return visit kind of schedule with people and build that kind of relationship, because they really had, as I said, even when they closed, they had a 3 to 4 month waiting list of people. I looked at case files of people when 58 were trying to get in, and one poor mother finally got in after being on the waiting list for like half a year. The clinic is just about a couple months away from closing, and she finally gets in. She gets her and her daughter in finally. Her 11-year-old daughter gets her in. So that's very typical. So it's average person really is only a couple weeks, maybe at most months. Yeah, a more extensive relationship was really not practical, given they were trying to see as many people as possible. I mean, they're only open. Yeah, they were open from 6 to 9, but they usually would stay open a little longer. There would usually be an overflow of time because there would still be someone out there, and they would want to get them because, you're out there, you spent all this time, and it came out, it's 9:30, they were still going to try to get you. But that's still a limited amount of time, 2 days a week. And they would close because of Thursday. They wouldn't operate if Thursday was Christmas, or Thursday was a Jewish holiday, or Thursday was Thanksgiving. They didn't operate. So there were days during the year where they did not. There were Tuesdays and Thursdays where they did not operate.
So this question is related to Man, I'm Nowhere. The famous.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I'm not sure that Professor Doyle mentioned Ellison's article, Harlem is Nowhere, 1947, which argues for the importance of the clinic. It is amazing. This is more a comment than a question, but I'll read it. It is amazing addressing Blacks who came from the South and had lost their sense of belonging in place, no matter how negative it was in the Jim Crow era. Black people with Caribbean backgrounds are not included in his assessment. Perhaps it will come up in the discussion response, but in case, there are 2 versions of the essay. I believe it first appeared in Holiday. So.
Oh, yeah. The one I've read is the one that was republished later in Shadow and Act, 64, I think, when he republished it. But yeah, it was written about, it reflects the mindset of Ellison at the time he was writing Invisible Man. So it's right in that period. And yeah, I totally agree. It does reflect, the Southern migration kind of experience, and the Caribbean migration experience is not really there. But I think he does capture very well the kind of the sense of how democratic this experience was for people who participated in it, and a way of grounding that these are folks who felt kind of underground, they felt underneath, they felt, they disconnected. And this is a way of connecting. The clinic was a way to try to reconnect them through psychiatry, through this clinic. And you saw something really democratic about that, about restoring connection. And you're absolutely right. It is that place, and part of being Black was part of being on the move, either Caribbean or from the South, or dislocated for a variety of other reasons. That dislocation, one of the problems with Black dislocation is that because of housing restrictions, there's so few places that you had the freedom to go. And so there's less of a chance to reground yourself. And so he saw kind of the clinic as a way to reground these people who are otherwise rootless because of the way that that essentially the spaces available for them have been restricted in order to create new roots after being uprooted.
Thank you. Daniel here says, Hilde Mosse was with Lee of Stan Lee Universe, the comics, on the Barry Farber show in 1968.
Yes, that's it. That's I've read the transcript.
Okay, he has a copy. They have a copy. Yeah, I I'm trying to remember in our own archives when we have ours from, or if it's also that same.
That is a
from
great
68.
interview.
Yeah.
Oh, it's a fabulous interview. I think both of them come off looking very good. That was by reading it. I don't know what they sounded like because, again, on radio, it's all about tone. It's all about these cues, now, especially now that, we're in virtual mode, we've been trying to we use kind of vocal cues since we don't have someone right in front of us. We have to really, kind of determine how a conversation's going. But it seemed like they really did acquit themselves very well. But again, they were talking across purposes. This inveterate, entrepreneur versus, kind of a Trotskyite. She was. I mean, a Trotskyite who had spent her career helping someone try to fuse Freudianism with Marxism. I mean, so it was going to be very difficult for them to really talk. But I would love this if anyone has kind of the actual tape. I would love to hear it. Plus, I love Stan Lee's voice. I'll just admit that.
I think that is the one we have at Leo back.
I would love to hear it because again, I'm a sucker for Stan Lee's voice. My son, when he was young, would just always have me. We lived in Mississippi. My son was born in New York, but we lived in Mississippi for about 4 years. I was teaching there at Mississippi State. My son, to get a little bit of New York, he would ask me to impersonate Stan Lee.
That's funny. Did Doctors Mosse and Wertham run afoul of the Committee for Un-American Activities regarding the operation of Lafargue Clinic?
I don't see evidence of that, but there's a couple things here. They didn't get it on the radar for HUAC or anything like that. So it never went to a state level or the national level in terms of, being labeled a pinko or a communist. But they did suspect that the reason why that the New York City Community Mental Health Board and then the mental hygiene, the Board of Mental Hygiene for the state of New York, that the reason why that they were denying their applications for tax-exempt status and to be recognized as a community mental health center, which they kept getting that denied, so they couldn't get public funding unless they could get that status and that tax-exempt status. They did. It was Mosse and Wertham both believed that they had been put on the blacklist. And in fact, in Wertham's papers at the Library of Congress, there is a little memo. I love back the 50s with the little phone memo pads. So there's a little memo that says on it, and written with kind of emphatic kind of energy. You can see it in it. It's kinetic the way it's written. It says, Lafargue is on the blacklist. In bold, kinetic, frenetic letters. And I remember seeing that and it hit me and I understood the context. This is someone who just got a phone call. And it was in the midst of other memos where it was in a bunch of memos. But the previous one and the one after it were attempts to try to get tax-exempt status for the clinic renewed and to get mental hygiene, community mental health center recognition. To get recognition as an actual, what they had called a mental hygiene center, or mental hygiene clinic, excuse me. Let me get the terminology straight. So in the midst of this, someone getting off the phone after trying to do this just said, we're on the blacklist. So if we don't know, but it seems awfully convenient that they were not being renewed at the time when Wertham was probably at his most infamous, his most famous, most well-known as the author of Seduction of the Innocent, the 1953 screed against comic books. And he was on TV, talking about the dangers of comic books with his thick accent. and all his other writings out there. Some of which railed against wealth redistribution, were for wealth redistribution and against capitalism. Some of these comments, all that's out there. So Hueck never went after him, but I think he may have been someone considered persona non grata by folks within the mental health leadership in New York State and on the New York the local metropolitan level.
Not good.
I think I don't know if I cannot confirm he got on some blacklist.
Right.
They had perception that they were.
Yeah. So, all right. I think with that we'll close. That's the questions that I have here.
Oh, okay.
Generally been covered.
Yeah.
And thank you, Professor Doyle, for being.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity. This was fantastic.
Yeah, and we'll be in touch and regarding that interview. And to everyone else, thank you for attending. And we hope to see you at future events. Thank you.